The first time she asked me to pretend to be her husband, I thought I misheard. My hands were greasy from changing brake pads at the shop, and the fluorescent lights above seemed suddenly too bright, too harsh, like they were spotlighting the absurdity of the moment. Pretend to what? I asked, voice cracking somewhere between disbelief and whatever the polite version of panic is. She didn't flinch. Not really. Her dark eyes, calm and sharp, met mine without blinking. There was a kind of confidence in her posture that made me feel both smaller and strangely exposed. 1 year, she said, as if that detail alone would normalize the whole idea. 1 year. No questions asked. You just play along. I wiped my hands on a rag that was already too dirty to use, my stomach doing somersaults I didn't have a name for. She leaned on the counter, casual, but I caught the subtle tension in the way her fingers drummed against the edge. Confident, yes, but not unshakable. I could see it in the twitch of her jaw, the way her shoulders carried a weight she tried to keep invisible. I swallowed and tried to focus on the engine in front of me, the familiar smell of oil and metal grounding me. But her presence had a gravity I couldn't ignore. She was layered, not the kind of woman you could put in a neat box. She had this aura of control, sure, but also these flashes, tiny, almost imperceptible, of softness, the way she paused mid-sentence when she didn't want to reveal something. It was frustrating and oddly magnetic. You do realize this is insane, right? I said finally, my voice uneven. Her lips curved slightly, a smile that didn't quite reach amusement. I've been told worse. And then she tilted her head, studying me like she could read the thoughts I didn't even know I had. That look, sharp, assessing, and yet not unkind, made me catch my own reflection in the grease-streaked glass of the shop door. I didn't like how nervous I suddenly felt. There was a pause, one of those silences that stretches just long enough to make your heart beat louder than usual. She looked down at the counter, brushing her fingers lightly across the surface, then back at me. It was almost casual, almost normal, but something about it made my chest tighten. A small gesture, and yet I couldn't stop thinking about it. Then she added, quietly, I know it's a lot to ask. I wouldn't if I had another option. Her voice had a trace of vulnerability buried beneath the usual composure. For a second, just a second, she wasn't the untouchable, commanding figure I'd assumed. She was someone carrying burdens, making impossible choices, and for some reason, that made her feel impossibly close. I rubbed the back of my neck, trying to pretend I wasn't already tangled up in thoughts about her. I didn't know what I was supposed to say. Yes, no, maybe, or just walk away and pretend none of this had ever happened. But even before I could answer, my gaze flicked to her hands again, how they rested lightly on the counter, how her ring caught the light. A subtle shimmer I could swear I hadn't noticed before. And then, the moment passed. She straightened, cleared her throat, and the spell of intimacy broke, replaced by the professional, controlled persona she always carried. I wanted to ask more, say more, but I didn't. I just nodded, because I realized I'd already started imagining how the next year, pretending, lying, and maybe, somehow, learning things about each other we weren't supposed to, might look. By the time I left the shop that night, I couldn't stop replaying it. Her gaze, the tilt of her head, the faintest exhale of frustration that seemed entirely unintentional. And the one thought I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried, was how easily I could picture her beside me, closer than I ever should. I didn't expect to see her at the hotel lobby that evening, clipboard in hand, brow furrowed like she was trying to solve a puzzle I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I'd come by to drop off some paperwork for her assistant, but instead, I found her crouched by the reception desk, muttering under her breath as she tapped at a tablet. Need a hand? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, though my stomach had its own opinion about this encounter. She glanced up, and for a split second, the armor slipped. Her eyes were tired, darker at the edges than usual, and there was a faint quiver at the corner of her mouth that didn't belong. She straightened instantly, but I'd seen it. That moment of hesitation, the vulnerability she didn't want anyone to notice. I've got it, she said, but the words were clipped, too quick. She moved to her feet, brushing imaginary dust from her blazer. But her hands betrayed her, slightly trembling, just enough to make me aware that beneath that polished exterior, she carried exhaustion. We moved down the hall together, our steps quiet on the polished floors. I carried the stack of papers, letting my fingers brush hers just slightly when passing them over. She didn't flinch, not outwardly, but I felt the subtle pause in her gait, the barely noticeable catch in her breath. "Are you sure you don't want a coffee?" I asked, nodding toward the small cafe at the end of the corridor. "I can't," she said softly, almost to herself. Her eyes darted away, scanning the empty hallway. I realized she wasn't talking about coffee. She was talking about letting someone in, letting anyone see her frailty, her fatigue, her doubt. I didn't push. I didn't speak. Instead, I watched. The curve of her smile when a delivery guy held the door for her. The way her shoulders eased for a fraction of a second before tightening again. The subtle way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she thought no one was looking. I noticed everything, and yet, I kept it to myself. We reached the room where she needed the document signed, and she paused at the door, a hand hovering over the handle. The silence stretched, charged, and uneven. She didn't want to speak. I didn't want to break it. It was a moment that felt suspended, a quiet energy humming between us, neither of us acknowledging the gravity of proximity. Then she sighed, a soft exhale I could almost feel in my chest. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was a tiny surrender. She let the door swing open, and I handed her the paperwork. Our fingers brushed again, this time a fraction longer. My pulse caught in my throat. She didn't pull away, didn't look at me, and yet the atmosphere shifted. For a heartbeat, the world outside that hallway, deadlines, responsibilities, even our absurd arrangement, fell away. There was only that quiet, electric tension between us, a moment that felt like a promise without words. As she focused on the papers, her brow knitting in concentration, I realized I couldn't stop noticing. The faint crease at the corner of her eyes when she smiled, the softness of her hands as they flipped the pages. And in that suspended, charged silence, I understood that something had begun between us. Something fragile, unspoken, and impossible to ignore. The rain started just as we were leaving the office, little sharp bursts against the glass doors that made the lobby smell faintly of wet concrete and leather polish. She held her umbrella awkwardly, one hand bracing it against the wind, the other clutching a folder like it could protect her from anything, myself included. "Wait," I said, jogging to catch up. "Here, let me." I grabbed the umbrella over both of us, and for a moment, the narrow arc of canvas forced our bodies closer than necessary. My shoulder brushed hers. That small contact made my chest tighten, and I caught myself staring at her profile, the way the streetlight reflected off the damp strands of her hair. She didn't step away, didn't acknowledge it, but I felt her shift slightly, a fraction of movement that said more than words ever could. There was a pause, neither of us speaking, the city's muted chaos falling behind the curtain of rain. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. "You're soaked," I said finally, a pretext, my own hands gripping the umbrella a little too tightly. She glanced at me, and for a split second, her eyes softened, the usual control slipping like mist. It was brief, just enough for me to wonder if I'd imagined it. I wanted to reach out, to brush the water off her sleeve, maybe tuck a stray hair behind her ear, but I didn't. Something about the timing felt dangerous. Too many rules, too many consequences. One wrong move, and the arrangement, the fragile equilibrium we'd been keeping, would collapse. Then her phone buzzed, a text from her ex. She stiffened immediately, the softness gone in an instant, replaced by the sharp, practiced precision of a woman who had long ago learned to guard herself. I wanted to ask, to say it's fine, but I didn't. I respected that line she'd drawn, even as it made my heart ache. We walked together under that single umbrella, silent except for the occasional scuff of shoes on wet pavement. I noticed everything. The way her fingers curled around the folder, the faint crease between her eyebrows, the soft sigh she let out when a gust nearly knocked the umbrella sideways. Every detail hammered the reminder that I was dangerously aware of her, in ways I shouldn't be. At the corner, we stopped. Traffic roared past, headlights throwing stripes of light across her face. The umbrella tilted slightly, shielding us both, and suddenly the world felt impossibly small. My hand twitched, a whisper of motion toward hers, but I caught myself. The closeness lingered, electric, and I could feel her breath against my cheek. "Here," she said softly, her words almost lost to the storm. She tilted the folder toward me, signaling the end of the proximity, the return to distance, but it felt deliberate, a gentle boundary I wasn't ready to respect. I nodded, swallowing the surge of something I couldn't name. My fingers lingered near hers just a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then we stepped apart. She moved toward her car, precise and controlled again, and I stayed under the umbrella for a moment longer, heart hammering, feeling the weight of what almost happened, and knowing it could have been everything, or nothing, depending on the next misstep. That night, the rain didn't just fall outside. I could feel it inside me too, drumming against the fragile walls I'd built, leaving me wondering how much longer I could resist reaching for her. We were sitting in her apartment, the kind of quiet that isn't comfortable but unavoidable. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the rain that had seeped in through the cracked window frame. Outside, the city hummed with life, but inside, it was just us, two people pretending everything was ordinary when nothing about the evening had been ordinary for weeks. I could feel her eyes on me, though she didn't speak. There was a tension there, thick and palpable, the kind that made your hands twitch without purpose. I cleared my throat, trying to fill the silence, but even my voice sounded wrong in the room, too loud, too urgent. "What are we doing?" she said finally, her voice soft, brittle. Not a joke, not an accusation, just a question that carried years of careful control and sudden vulnerability. I froze, the words hanging between us like smoke in the dim light. I wanted to answer, but the truth was heavier than I could lift. I don't know," I said, because it was the only honest thing I could offer. I looked at her hands resting on her knees, how her fingers curled slightly, how she tapped a rhythm that didn't match the rain outside. She sighed, a long, slow exhale that sounded like surrender and frustration rolled into one. This pretending, it's more than I expected," she whispered. Her gaze dropped to the floor, but I could see the tremor in her jaw, the tiny hitch in her breath. Vulnerability, real, unfiltered, flashed across her face before she buried it again under the habitual mask of composure. I wanted to reach for her, to tell her it was okay, that I felt the same disorientation, the same pull I couldn't name. But I didn't. Not yet. I sat there, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension breathe, because saying anything now might shatter what little control remained. "I think," she began again, her voice trembling, "that I didn't realize how complicated this would feel, how dangerous it could be, just being near you." She paused, and I could see her fighting herself, trying not to betray too much, trying not to let the walls crumble. But the cracks were there, and I was staring right at them. The storm outside seemed to echo the storm between us, rain drumming against the window, wind tugging at the edges of the blinds. Every small movement, the tilt of her head, the way her shoulders hunched, spoke volumes I couldn't put into words. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't leaving, that I wanted to understand the danger, that I wanted something I didn't even have the right to want. But instead, I just leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly, letting her words sink into the spaces between us. Finally, she looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed emotion. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she said softly. "And yet, I feel like we're already in too deep. I can't pretend anymore." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched her, the woman who had been untouchable, controlled, and somehow impossibly layered, revealing a fragment of fragility I would never forget. And as the rain pounded on the windows, I realized this wasn't about pretending anymore. Not for either of us. And then she whispered, almost to herself, almost to the storm, "I don't know if I can stop myself from falling." I hadn't meant to linger in her apartment that long, but somehow my shoes were off, and I was sitting on the edge of the couch while she rummaged through a drawer. The quiet between us had become comfortable in its own uneasy way, like we'd both agreed on unspoken terms. Close enough to feel, distant enough to survive. She pulled out a small, worn envelope, edges frayed from being opened too many times. She didn't hand it to me immediately. Instead, she held it like it weighed more than paper, like it carried pieces of herself she wasn't sure anyone should see. "It's something I haven't looked at in years," she said softly, voice uneven. I could hear the tremor, subtle but unmistakable, the one she tried so hard to hide in boardrooms and hallways. "It's from someone I lost. Before all of this." I didn't reach for it. I waited, silently, letting her set the pace. Her hands shook as she lifted the letter, unfolded the paper inside, and read the words like she was seeing them for the first time again. I could see the lines of her face soften, then tighten, a storm passing in a glance. "I think," she murmured, "I've spent so long pretending I was fine, that I could move on. But some losses, they don't leave you. They just hide, waiting for a moment to remind you." I wanted to say something reassuring, to close the distance between us physically or verbally, but no words felt adequate. Instead, I just watched, the small rise and fall of her shoulders, the quiet exhale she didn't realize she was holding, the way her eyes shimmered with memories she wasn't ready to speak aloud. "I never thought I'd feel this," she said finally, voice barely above the hum of the city outside. She glanced at me then, a fleeting look that flickered between invitation and retreat, as if testing whether I could handle the weight of her past. I swallowed, heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with rain or late nights. "You don't have to talk about it," I said, but she shook her head slightly, and I realized she needed to, even if only for herself. She handed me the envelope then, carefully, like it might shatter if gripped too hard. I peeked at the handwriting, familiar, delicate, almost painfully tender. A name jumped out at me, and I paused, my chest tightening in a mix of recognition and unease. "Did you know him?" she asked quietly, watching my reaction. "I knew of him," I admitted. "Not well, but enough to know he mattered. He mattered a lot." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might disappear into herself, like she had before when life's edges grew too sharp. Then, slowly, she exhaled, the tension releasing from her shoulders in a way that made me realize how much she'd been holding in. We sat there, wordless, connected through the ghost of someone neither of us could fully name, but both felt in the room. My hand hovered near hers on the couch, not touching, but the space between us suddenly vibrated with everything unspoken. And then she whispered, a bare thread of sound. "I didn't think I could remember him without breaking, but maybe I can. Maybe I'm ready." The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Outside, the city had quieted, the storm finally spent, leaving the streets slick and glimmering under the dim streetlights. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the envelope from last night lying between us like a fragile bridge we weren't sure we could cross. I wanted to speak, to say something clever or comforting, but the words didn't exist. Instead, I just looked at her, really looked, taking in the faint lines around her eyes, the way her hair caught the low light, the tiny tremor in her fingers as they rested on her lap. She caught my gaze and didn't look away, which felt like permission, though I wasn't sure for what. "I don't want to pretend anymore," she said quietly. Not dramatic, not tearful, just a statement that hung in the air, weightless yet undeniable. Whatever this is, it feels like it's too late to go back." I nodded, because I couldn't deny it. It had been too late for months, maybe from the first time our hands brushed over the umbrella in the rain, or the way our silences had started speaking louder than conversation ever could. She shifted slightly, closer this time, though neither of us mentioned the distance we were closing. Our knees brushed, a subtle spark that neither of us needed to comment on. I realized then that the walls we'd been so careful to maintain were not just lowered. They were gone, brick by brick, without either of us consciously demolishing them. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured, and I understood that meant she was giving me a choice. A real choice. Not the forced agreements of arrangements or pretenses. just presence. I moved a fraction closer, careful not to overstep, letting the space between us shrink by inches rather than leaps. My hand hovered near hers, and when I finally let it rest lightly on hers, she didn't pull away. Her fingers curled slightly around mine, tentative, yet firm enough to make my chest tighten. We didn't speak after that. There was no confession, no dramatic declaration, no promises shouted into the night. There didn't need to be. The quiet shared space between us said everything that words could never capture. The years, the burdens, the heartbreaks, the moments we had tried to ignore. Her forehead leaned against my shoulder eventually, light as a whisper, as if testing the ground before fully trusting it. I rested my head just above hers, breathing in the faint scent of her shampoo and coffee, and felt the last of my restraint dissolve. Time didn't feel measured anymore. The hum of the heater, the distant city, the soft rhythm of our breathing, it was all enough. It was precise, imperfect, fragile, and utterly whole. And in that quiet, earned space, I realized something essential. We didn't need words to define this. We didn't need the world to approve, the past to vanish, or a perfect story. All that mattered was this. Here, together, unspoken but inevitable. Her hand tightened ever so slightly around mine, and I knew we had crossed the invisible line that had kept us separate for months. The collapse hadn't been sudden or theatrical. It had been quiet, patient, and irrevocable. I exhaled softly, finally allowing myself to rest. We stayed like that, in silence, as the city breathed around us, and it felt like home. I still think about that year sometimes, though now it feels less like a memory and more like a quiet pulse underneath everything else in my life. Sitting in my apartment, the hum of the city outside like a soft reminder that time moves even when you don't, I realize how much changed, how much we changed. I was 20-something, reckless in small ways, thinking the world would bend around me if I just tried hard enough. She carried years I couldn't fully understand at the time. Grief and resilience folded into the way she smiled, the way she moved, the way she held herself even when the room threatened to crumble around her. Pretending to be her husband wasn't just a contract, it was a doorway, and neither of us knew what we were walking into. There were moments I'll never forget, the silences that said more than any confession, the rain-soaked walks where proximity became unbearable, the shared spaces that blurred the line between arrangement and something impossibly human. I learned to see her, really see her, beyond the veneer of control, beyond the perfection she demanded of herself. And she learned to let someone in, cautiously, piece by piece, even when the world told her she shouldn't. We weren't perfect. We argued, stumbled, avoided the weight of unspoken truths at times. But we survived those missteps because we noticed each other, because we allowed the small things, the brush of a hand, a shared laugh, a glance that lingered too long, to speak volumes that words never could. That year changed the way I understood love. Not the cinematic, dramatic kind, but the subtle, earned kind that grows in quiet rooms, in stolen moments, in the patience to watch someone rebuild and choose you again, silently, every single day. She showed me that love isn't always fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it's staying, listening, being there for someone when the world feels impossibly heavy. And I think she realized she could trust again, even with scars she thought would never fade. She could lean, just a little, and let the weight of the past rest somewhere safe. She could be seen fully and still be whole. We didn't need a grand finale, a dramatic reveal, or a perfect resolution. The story lived in the quiet aftermath, in the moments that followed the storm, in the gentle understanding that we had both chosen each other without saying it aloud. Sometimes I catch myself smiling at nothing, thinking of the way her hand fit mine like it had always been meant to, or the faint trace of her perfume that lingers long after she's gone. And I realize that love isn't about chasing or capturing. It's about noticing and being noticed in ways that are subtle but transformative. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?